In modern anime, there are a few characters that embody bravery as well as Rengoku from Demon Slayer. His message was simple: set your heart ablaze and never dwell on your own weakness. In a lot of ways, the flaming katana he carries is a reflection of this same spirit, and in this video, I'm going to try and make the best real-world version of it that I possibly can. Before getting into the build itself though, I think it's important for me to discuss exactly what I'm trying to accomplish. Starting off, my goal is not to create a replica, it's to create what I think the sword would look like in the real world. You're probably wondering how those two are different at all, and I think that's a fair question. If you think about it, the goal of the animation team is to create a sword with an extremely visually striking design. After all, 99% of the audience would see a fire sword and think, wow, that's the coolest thing ever, so why would the animators need to worry about anything else? My job as a bladesmith is a little bit different. I want to take those same bombastic design elements and recreate them in real life using modern materials, some traditional techniques, and a little bit of historical knowledge. One great example of this is the sword blade itself. If you look at Rengoku's sword in pretty much any frame of the anime, it has a jet black spine and a crimson red edge. The only way to achieve these colors in real life onto steel is with some sort of coating, like with spray paint or Cerakote. I genuinely despise this idea. A coating would mean painting on the appearance of Hamon rather than quenching into the steel itself, and to me that feels really cheap, so I'm going to avoid it whatever the cost. The fittings present a similar challenge. All of the fittings in the anime are extremely colorful. In fact, the guard is yellow, red, and orange. The easiest way to achieve these colors is once again with a coating, but I thought it would be much cooler to get these colors with traditional patinas and my material choice. This means that the overall build becomes orders of magnitude more difficult, but that's what you're all here for, right? Anyways, I've blabbered on for long enough, let's finally get started. Everything that you just saw me do in the background was setting up my initial billet for the sword. I decided to fall back on the traditions of katana making and create a billet with a hard steel exterior and a softer, mild steel core. If you know anything about katanas, you'll know that this should theoretically create a sword that is more resistant to shattering while still retaining a very strong edge. The only thing that I was uncertain about though was that this billet was assembled with modern steel, W2 on the outside and 1018 mild steel on the inside. I didn't know if this combination of steels would give me the Hamon that I wanted when quenched, but I felt confident enough in the idea to give it a try anyway. This process of forge welding my initial billet together is essentially the same process as the Sunobe step that traditional Japanese smiths use. It's the stage where the final billet is consolidated and drawn out into a preform that will later be forged to its finished geometry. Now, I'm not technically using the same taco method that those smiths use, but modern steels are so much harder to forge weld than tamahagane, and because of that, I chose to clean and stack my steel before forge welding instead.
Damn, that looks really solid already.
It's pretty early in the forging process, but I already had to start thinking about the final blade size. Rengoku's canonical height is about 5'10" or 177 centimeters, which means he's actually pretty tall for a katana wielder. This means that I had to make the longest sword that I could fit in my heat treating oven for it to be accurate, and I ultimately decided on a blade length of 28 inches with an 8-inch tang. I didn't assemble my initial billet with a ton of steel, so I was slightly worried that I wouldn't be able to hit my intended length, but if you've seen any of my past videos, you'll know that I always give myself too much steel, and I trusted that about myself and kept moving forward with the steel that I had. I knew that while drawing the steel out, I had to know exactly where my mild steel was in the billet, so before I started forging, I made sure to mark on the end of my handle the orientation of the billet. If I got this wrong, I'd have a katana with a soft edge and a hard spine, and I'd argue that's not super ideal. One of the fairly interesting things about katana is that they're much thicker than you would think. At the base of the blade right in front of the Habaki, katana can be as thick as 0.3 inches, and that's after all of the grinding and polishing. These aren't meant to be thin, flimsy swords, and this means that I was aiming for a preform that was about 3/8 of an inch thick, tapering to a little more than a 1/4 inch at the tip and the end of the tang, almost like a super exaggerated kite.
Okay, we're up to 25 already. Get this drawn out, we can get up to like 28, and then once I finalize everything preformed, we'll be at like 30, and then once I bevel and draw everything out, I think we'll be good.
The traditional method of forging in the tip of a katana is to actually cut off some material at an angle, and then you take that and bend it back upwards. In the past when I've done this, technically it was just for show, and it didn't really benefit the piece at all, but this time I had the soft steel mixed with the hard steel, and it was entirely necessary to avoid having a soft tip. That might be a little difficult to understand if you've never seen this step before, so I drew up a couple diagrams to hopefully make it easier to envision. One interesting thing about forging a katana is that there's a couple of the steps that are fairly modular. One example is that it doesn't really matter whether you finish the Sunobe first or forge the tip first. As long as both are done by the time you start forging the bevels, it should be okay. For this piece, I was halfway through the Sunobe step, got tired of using my press, and decided that I wanted to swing a hand hammer for a bit, and that's what I did. As I finish setting the preform, it's a good idea to take another look at Rengoku's katana, or really Demon Slayer katanas in general, and figure out what geometry we're trying to forge. One of the first things I noticed while watching the show was the presence of a yokote line at the tip. That immediately sets these swords apart from something like the average katana in One Piece, because those don't usually have yokote at all. This alone narrows the possibilities quite a bit, and I was already fairly confident that the sword was Shinogi Zukuri geometry, but I wanted a little more evidence before committing to it. If we take a little closer look at the sword, we can see no visible grooves or hologround sections near the spine, and in some frames we can see a clearly defined ridge line along the back of the sword. If we put all these together, it points pretty clearly to Rengoku's katana being Shinogi Zukuri geometry.
Nice, okay. This is looking pretty good. A lot of times when I make katana, I leave the front really, really wide, so I spend a lot of time thinning this part down. This part looks good. I think I'm gonna flip it around, isolate my tang area, so that I know exactly how much material I have to work with for the blade.
I've always been pretty bad at treating the tang material with the same amount of respect as the tip, and it sort of makes sense why, but I wanted to be better this time and really isolate and shape the tang preform. One thing that I haven't mentioned in the video yet is that this isn't just me making a sword for a YouTube video. I actually have a client who commissioned this piece for $18,000. That's a lot of money and an equally large amount of pressure, so I wanted to treat every part of this blade with respect. On a Shinogi Zukuri katana, there are 3 sets of bevels that you need to worry about. You have the spine bevels, also known as the muni, the spine side bevels, which are known as the Shinogi Ji, and finally you have your edge bevels. You could technically only forge in the edge and the spine side bevels, and then grind in the muni, but it's best practice to make sure that the forged blade has all the geometry in it before any grinding. Now, to actually get this precise geometry into the steel, what I'm doing here is essentially forging these bevels from the top down. I start with the muni on the first 5 or 6 inches of the blade, and then I turn the blade and forge in the Shinogi Ji. And then once both of those are done, I finally move on to my edge bevels. This order of operations makes it so that the blade looks nothing like a katana until you actually start forging the edge, so it's pretty important that I trust my order of operations. When I first started forging katana, I didn't really understand the importance of the spine side bevels, and essentially only forged the blade bevels and the muni. What happens when you ignore the spine side is that you have to keep correcting the bend that comes from forging your edge, and that messes up the muni. The worst part is that it's almost impossible to get a crisp Shinogi line. After I discovered the importance of forging these spine side bevels, forging katana became a lot easier.
That's looking pretty good. This first 10 inches or so, that's pretty much finalized geometry. Just need to slowly bring that back all the way until the start of the tank. Good.
One of the most perpetual pieces of knowledge about katana on the internet is regarding the fact that you're supposed to forge them straight and get the actual curve in the quenching process. It's always so interesting to me that everyone latches onto this singular piece of information, and because of it, there's a good chunk of people that consider katana that are forged with a curve as fake katana. I'm not the biggest fan of gatekeeping something that you've heard about once on the internet, so I'm going to take this time to set the record straight and sort of give a crash course on katana curves. Now, to start off, it's entirely true that traditional katana were forged fairly straight and then gained a good amount of curve in the quench. This is because the claying process to differentially heat treat the sword produced martensite on the edge, which is less volumetrically dense than the soft steel under the clay on the spine. This would in turn curve the blade into the classic katana shape. What most people don't know though is that the entire claying process rose out of necessity, due to the fact that the steel that these smiths used was so low in quality that they needed a charcoal-based clay on the edge to actually harden the steel. This means that it's not as simple as katana are curved in the quench, and more so, to overcome the limitations of their materials, bladesmiths clayed their blades to fully harden their edges, and over time people fully attributed that to what makes a katana real. This sort of begs the question though, of what this means for blades forged from modern steel. The first thing that I want to mention is that modern steel is more than good enough to harden without clay, so using clay at all is purely for the purpose of putting a hamon on the blade. Modern steel is also usually quenched into oil as opposed to water, and if you quench a clayed sword into oil, it bends the opposite way compared to being quenched in water. I'm planning to quench this sword into water though, so I'm mostly forging it straight, but that doesn't mean that if I plan to quench this sword into oil and forged a bend into it, that it would be a quote-unquote fake katana. I know that me talking about this is not really going to change the fraction of people that still believe this, but as long as some people understand the true process, I'm more than happy.
Inch and a quarter there. Ought to be a little bit bigger than that at the end. Probably one more heat. The blade is basically like done now, but my tang is pretty short, so I'm gonna do something that I've never tried before, which is a scarf weld. If you want to forge two things together, and you just had like two bars of rectangular stock, like this, and you wanted to just like make them into one piece, you get cold shuts around right here and right here, and your final piece would sort of look like you might have a little overlap right there, and we don't want that. So what we're gonna do instead is we're gonna do something like this. And it looks funny, but if you forge weld right here, these 2 points right here are gonna sort of blend in perfectly. And because these are tapering, you don't have to hammer as much, but the end result will still be a perfectly straight bar.
One of the reasons I decided to do a scarf weld here is that I don't usually get the opportunity to delve into the world of more traditional blacksmithing. This is the kind of weld that you do when you're forging something like a gate and you don't have enough material, and it doesn't usually come up in the world of bladesmithing. Now, I've never done one of these welds, but I have done many forge welded bolsters in the past for my chef's knives, and aside from the prep that I'm doing here to the end of the tang and the mild steel piece, I figured it shouldn't be too difficult. Once the two pieces had the right shape, I tried just using flux to stick the two pieces together because I saw this on a bunch of Instagram reels, and it didn't end up working at all. So I decided to just go over to my welding area and just put a small tack weld to connect the two pieces.
Alright, it's connected with one weld bead on this side. I couldn't get it to stick on this side, but I think this is all I need. And I think I'm just gonna get it up to forge welding temperature, hit it, flux it, do it like 2 times, and it should set.
I could tell at this point that the welds were taking fairly well, but I didn't do a great job of keeping everything flush, so I went over to my grinder and cleaned off some of that shmoo. After that, it was just a matter of getting it uniform on the press, cutting off some of the excess material, and then forging the tang bevels. Yes, the bevels on the katana continue all the way through the tang, and this is another thing that younger Jesse didn't realize until a couple years ago. One thing to keep in mind here is that even though my blade is fairly straight, I have to put a slight bend in my tang before the heat treat. I mentioned earlier that katana tangs are supposed to be soft, and this means that I'm not going to gain a curve in my tang during a quench. This sort of means that I need to predict the future curve in my blade in order to have my tang and blade match up well, but having done many of these quenches before, I had a good idea of what to expect.
We'll call that good. Alright. I'm not gonna lie, that's the cleanest katana I've ever forged.
The first thing that I need to do to this blade after forging is to thermal cycle it. This is essentially 3 cycles of heating and cooling to these temperatures on screen right here to ensure that the grain size and carbon content are uniform and to reduce internal stress in the blade. This is a really important step, but it's especially important here because I have that soft steel core.
Alright, she's been soaking for a good amount of time. Oh my. Uh-oh. Tang is pretty warped. Oh my god, what is that tang? I have to fix that right now. That's actually so bad. Alright, please don't be as warped as last time.
One of the annoying things about straightening long blades like this is that hot air refracts light differently from cold air. It's so bad sometimes that I can't even see the blade itself. This is what I saw when I was trying to straighten the blade. Very interesting stuff. With the blade thermal cycled and ready for quench, it was time to do some rough grinding. Usually when I rough grind something, it's purely to save time after quench because the steel is soft before the quench, but for this katana it has a much more important purpose. W2 is a shallow hardening steel, and this means that it's perfect for Hamons, but it also means that it has some quirks. Let me explain. Rengoku's katana has a very distinct Hamon, and I was going to put clay on it in a very specific pattern to get said Hamon. The problem is that even though I forged the geometry pretty accurately, the sword was still fairly thick. If I quenched the blade as is while super thick, I'd probably get the Hamon that I wanted, but I would have to grind it a lot after the quench. And because W2 is a shallow hardening steel, the Hamon doesn't go all the way through the blade. This means that I would probably grind straight through that beautiful Hamon during the grinding process. This means I have an interesting equation on my hands. Grinding it thinner would mean a better Hamon on the finished piece, but leaving it thicker would make cracking and warping in the quench less likely. I've done a lot of thinking about this and talked to a good amount of people, and the conclusion was that I was going to aim for an edge thickness of around 100 thou, with my spine fairly close to final dimension. This would give me a good balance of safety and a good Hamon as well. I was pretty much at 100 thou here, so I did one last thing to ensure my blade's safety in the quench, and that was to break all of my hard corners with the slack belt. This helps ensure that there are no stress concentrations on my edge, and hopefully decrease the chance of my blade cracking. Alright, so it's very clear that in any image or frame that Rengoku's holding his katana, that the Hamon is supposed to be a flame Hamon. It's almost sort of like the Hamon that I put on Enma, but this one is quite literally on a flame katana, so it has to embody that fire look. And honestly, that shouldn't be too bad. The clay that I'm using here is something called Satanite refractory cement. In the past, I've tried pre-mixed stuff like Hercules furnace cement, but I found that for more intricate Hamons, I really need the ability to control the viscosity of my clay. Oops. Alright, that's about the consistency we want. It's almost a liquid. I need it to be thin, or else I won't be able to get those super small tendrils. In a lot of ways, claying the spine is another step in the katana making process that has achieved almost mythical status. I constantly hear people say stuff like, oh, if you don't clay your blade, then it's not a real katana. Let's think about this for a second. Did the smiths back in the day even know what a quote-unquote real katana was? I'll talk about this more later in the video, but there's definitely some interesting stuff to be said in response to this question. But yeah, back to what's actually happening. To get the pattern that I wanted with the clay, I sort of just alternated between two popsicle sticks to paint a flame design onto the blade. I wanted it to feel organic, but also flamboyant, and just like it was pulled straight from an anime. Alright, now we wait. With the clay drying, it was now time to set up for the quench. To hold the water, I'm using the same fish tank that I got to make shusui with, and I'm simply filling it with a garden hose. Something funny about this step is that you have to pick exactly where you want the fish tank to be before filling it, because there's absolutely no way you'll be able to move it once it's filled. One thing I did to prepare the water was I poured a bunch of water softener salt into the tank. This should theoretically reduce the aggression of the water quench by reducing the amount of bubbles from the water, and it should heavily decrease the chance of the blade cracking. Now, even though I poured a bunch of salt into the water, I still wanted to do an interrupted quench. This means that I'm going to be going into the salt water for about 3 seconds, and then immediately moving the blade into some hot oil. Blades usually crack in a water quench on the lower end of the temperature spectrum, and by putting the blade into warm oil when it's still fairly hot, it should theoretically just remove the cracking chance from the equation. I've done this process multiple times in the past, and it's worked every time, but you never know what can happen. Let's do this thing. Alright.
Oh my god, okay. This is the most work I've put into a blade before katana quench, aka making my own billet. Alright, what can go wrong? Let's go. don't think I heard a crack. It would have been very apparent. I'm gonna hold it in here for a long ass time. You didn't hear any cracks, right? I'm like scared to pull it out. Ooh, that's pretty good. Oh, perfect curve. Here's some cardboard. I need this to get down to at least 350 degrees, and then we're ready to go in. Actually, technically, because this is a sword, I can wait for it to go to like under 400, and then we're good. But this is gonna take a minute, and I just need to hope that the blade doesn't crack in the time it takes for this to cool down. Okay, so it's been about an hour, and the kiln is at 364, so it's pretty perfect. And now we get to see if there's a crack that developed. I don't know the chances that there's a crack, but all I know is that if there is, I'm gonna have to do what I did in all the other katana videos that are on this channel and forward another one. That looks pretty good. I don't see any cracks. Oh my god, pretty straight too. Look at that. That's what the clamping does. Great sword. That is impeccable curve. Holy sh! Yeah, I don't see any cracks. I'm not even gonna take off the clay right now. I think that, like, there's a certain clip on YouTube of somebody scraping their blade right after the quench and it cracking. You know what? We're gonna temper this at 420 degrees because funny number and also because it's a sword. All right, that's the first time on this channel I've had to quench a katana once. And it feels really freaking good. Oh.
At this point, I felt a good amount of relief because the curve meant that I got a Hamon of some kind, but to really see what was going on in the steel, I would have to scrape off the clay and grind it a little bit.
Alright, so we definitely have a flaming Hamon, which is good. It's a little bit closer to the spine area than you would usually see it on the anime katana, but I still have a bit of grinding to do, and I think it'll help give the katana a little bit more like traditional soul. So yeah, I'll call that good, and we'll go in for the second temper cycle, and we can do some final grinding.
I'm not gonna lie, everything that I just said in the video was pure cope. Some of you probably already saw it in my face, but the Hamon I got was just not good enough for this sword. I didn't really know why at first, but after some thinking, I concluded that the most likely suspect was the mild steel core. I knew that the soft core construction worked for traditional steel, but maybe it doesn't work as well for modern steel. This means that just like every other katana that I've made on this channel, I had to restart. I decided to forge the new sword from a uniform piece of W2 bar stock in hopes of getting a better Hamon, and once again, I'm really happy that I had to reforge it. I got a much cleaner geometry, and even got an extra inch into the blade compared to the first one. Some other things that I did differently on this blade were that I made the clay a little bit thicker, and I also decreased the austenitizing temperature to 1450 degrees Fahrenheit. Both of these things should theoretically help push that Hamon closer to my edge.
Alright, katana number 2. The only things that are different are the temp it's at and the thickness of the clay. Hopefully it turns out well. I saw a good curve on that one, so good first sign. Get this into the cardboard. Okay, I think that one went a lot better than the first one. Not to say that the first one went bad. Yeah, I'm not even worried about the blade cracking anymore. I think the interrupted quench is actually quite safe. Yeah, all I need to do is just temper this one and then check it in between those temper cycles. I think it'll look good. Okay, it's been an hour. Whoa. Oh my god, the clay is like popping off the spine, which I guess isn't necessarily a bad thing. A little bit warped. Let's do a quick Hamon check. Oh!
That is, okay, that's actually perfect. I'm so happy that I decided to try this again on another katana. That is like, that's exactly what you should see in a katana that's meant to be Rengoku's katana. Perfect flames, good distance away from the edge. Yeah, that's perfect. Oh my god. Alright, so both blades are tempered. And this is actually the first time in a katana video ever where I've had more than one viable blade. So I have to choose between these two. I think most things are pointing me to choosing the second one I made because the Hamon is so much better. It's got like an inch longer blade. The only thing that isn't good is the curve. I think I like the curve on the first one just a little bit more, but I have room to potentially grind a little bit more curve in on this one. So that essentially makes it to where there's nothing better about the first one than the second one, so I'm just gonna go with the second one. So yeah, I ended up choosing the second one, and I'm really glad that I decided to take the time and redo the whole process. It's kind of funny to think about it, because in general, when I do fancy Damascus chef's knives or other swords, I essentially never have to redo any of the steps. Katana, though, are a bit different for me, and I think they demand a sacrifice to come out looking good. People have described Hamons as souls trapped into steel, and who knows, maybe that's an actual thing. But yeah, it's time to grind this thing, but before I can go too far, I have to get this thing straight. In my opinion, there are three basic things that a blade needs for me to consider it good. The first thing is whether the blade is straight. And I don't mean that it's globally straight or that it looks somewhat straight. It needs to be a freaking laser. It's so basic, but it's definitely the first thing that I judge a knife by when I hold it. Now, the process that I'm using here to straighten this sword is with a modern carbide hammer, but the cool thing is that traditional smiths use something very similar. In The Art of the Japanese Sword by Yoshine Yoshihara, we can see him using a small pick hammer to straighten his swords, and the mechanism behind this is the exact same as my carbide hammer. Alright, I think it's pretty straight. One way that I can tell is that I can do this, rest it on its spine, and it can stay in both of these orientations without favoring one over the other. That means it's pretty symmetrical and pretty straight. The second thing on my list of things that a blade needs is for it to be true to its intended design. Now, what do I mean by this? Katanas have a very specific profile and grind, and if you intend for the sword to have these, but maybe you slip on the grinder, you take a chunk out, and then you have to grind the rest of the blade down to cover your mistake, you'll be left with a sword that is slightly different from your intention. Now, say you were making a chef's knife intended to be a santoku, but maybe your mind wanders and you grind a little bit too much off the tip and change your profile. Now you're left with something still fully functional as a chef's knife, but not necessarily what your intention for the piece was. I'd say that this one is the most difficult to do, and I personally have trouble sometimes checking this one off the list, but regardless, I still think that it's really important. Anyways, directly after the quench, this sword is still pretty thick, and the goal during this final grinding process is to shave off all of that excess weight to finalize the distal taper and to eventually put a convex grind onto the edge. Now, of these things, the one that I need to target first is that distal taper, and the best way to check my progress is to just use a pair of calipers and measure the entire blade. Alright, at the thickest point, we're at about 312 thou, 308, 285, 268, 261, 253. Okay, so we already have a pretty consistent distal taper. At no point further along the blade is it thicker than it is like back on the blade. That's what we want. The third and last thing on my list of things that a blade needs is simple: symmetry. It sounds fairly self-explanatory, and I think that some of you are wondering why this is even something I look for when the first thing on my list was straightness, but a blade can be straight and easily be asymmetrical. The grinds on both sides of the blade have to be exactly the same, and the edge has to be centered to the spine. If it's not centered, then the blade is twisted, and would become very apparent when swung by the user. Throughout the entire final grinding process, I was constantly thinking about this and checking to see if I ground more off one side, and if I did, I would immediately correct it by grinding on the other side. Grinding is a really delicate balancing act, and once again, it's still something that I'm trying to improve at. Alright, so my edge is at about 60 thou right now, which I need to start thinking about how I'm going to do the convex. We're at about 40 thou, close to the tip. I think I'm going to get everything done to that 40 thou, and then I'm going to take off that platen and then start doing things with the slack. Everything is like very centered, so yeah, that's all I'm going to do. Get it to 40 thou, and then I'm going to start doing convex. As I do this last little bit of grinding, there's something that I'm extremely excited to tell you guys about. One of the questions and comments that I get the most is, Jesse, how can I get started in the world of bladesmithing? Usually when someone asks me this, I recommend taking a class, but for most people, this isn't very accessible. I mentioned in my last video that I was working on a beginner bladesmithing course, and yeah, it's finally done and ready. It's an online course that can be watched from anywhere, and I think contains knowledge that you can't find anywhere else on the internet. I cover a lot of basics like how to source beginner blacksmithing tools and the fundamentals of hammer technique, and I also walk you through the entire process of making a beginner chef's knife with extremely detailed instruction. The course itself contains over 9 hours of dense knowledge, and I spent a lot of time and effort to leave little to the imagination. It really was a labor of love, and I hope it can help some of you guys get into this amazing world of bladesmithing. If you're interested, check it out at jhumasterclass.com, and as a thank you to everyone who's watching this video, for the first week that this video is live, using code Rengoku will get you 10% off. Alright, let's get ready for some convexing. If you look at the cross-section of a Shinogi Zukuri katana, you'll see that the edge bevels are convex, aka slightly bowed outward. I feel that this convex grind is usually the most overlooked part of the grind, but it definitely has its historical reasons for being there. The first thing to keep in mind is that traditional katana are supposed to have a 0 grind, and this means unlike most modern knives, there's supposed to be no secondary sharpening bevel. The convex grind helps ensure that in spite of not having that more obtuse secondary bevel, the edge can still be fairly strong. It's almost like a really big appleseed edge, like the ones that you'd put on something like a chopper. The way that I was putting this convex grind onto my katana is that I removed the hard platen on my grinder and only have the belt's tension as a backing. This rounds out the contact surface and gives me a nice slight convex. The important thing I had to keep in mind here was that even though I had a convex edge, the Shinogi line or that central bevel still had to be sharp and crisp, and if I get my angles wrong at all, I can round out that Shinogi. That wouldn't be ideal, so I'd say that throughout the entire grinding process, I was most locked in for this little bit right here. When I was satisfied with the convex and got it to a nice 400 grit finish, the last thing I did was spend a little time cleaning up the grinds on my spine. These already look pretty good though, so this didn't take too long. Alright, so at this point, this is basically final ground. I just need to hand sand it and make it look pretty. But I'm not going to do that just yet because I don't want to scratch anything when I work on all the fittings. At this point, a traditional Japanese bladesmith would consider their work done. They would hand this mostly ground sword to a polisher, and then just start on a new sword. For me though, it's a little different. Rengoku's katana has a complicated blade, but the fittings are equally detailed. To create a true real-life version of this sword, I have to make all of the fittings from scratch myself. I know that a lot of you guys like these longer videos, and I have good news for you. We're just getting started. Now, the first fitting that I'm going to be working on is the Habaki, and what I'm doing here is just prepping my tang for that process. The Habaki is essentially a collar that sits right under the blade on top of the guard, and since the tang tapers, I have to work on this first or else I wouldn't know how to shape the slots in the rest of the fittings. Alright, Habaki time. Alright, so for the Habaki, I have to do something that I've never done before, which is a 2-part Habaki. The center right here is just brass, but this part right here is an outer shell. It's, like I mentioned before, it's a 2-part Habaki. This part's going to be made of copper. So yeah, this is going to be interesting. This is going to be very detailed jewelry saw work. And then, yeah, the brass part should be the same as every other Habaki that I've ever done. To get started on this fairly ornate Habaki, I got a piece of 1/8 inch thick brass and cut off what I thought was the right amount. In the back of my mind, I figured that brass and copper were pretty similar because, brass is an alloy of copper. And since I had made so many copper Habaki in the past, that this process shouldn't be too bad. The problem is that brass is less ductile and work hardens much faster than copper, so this process became more of a learning experience than repeating what I had done in the past. Now, it's almost impossible to complete this entire shaping process without doing a process called annealing. To anneal something like copper, all you have to do is heat it up to a red temperature and then quench it in water. I figured that brass should be fairly similar, so I tried heating up with a torch, and this ended up being 200 powered, so I just turned on my forge and tried it that way. The annealing seemed to work at first, and definitely felt like I was softening the brass. I got the ends drawn out a good bit more, and I sort of just repeated this process of hammering, heating, and quenching until I thought I had enough length on either side.
saw this on another YouTube channel. Let's hope it works. Oh. Okay, that got the bed started. I'm gonna do the rest of the place. Oh, shoot.
Yeah, I got a small crack in it, and I figured it wasn't worth trying to work around it, so I just restarted. I did everything the same, but made sure to anneal much more frequently, and before I knew it, I was right back where I left off. The most important thing about making a habaki is that it has to essentially be glove tight to the tang. What I had to do was play this delicate game of alternating between hammering it on a piece of square stock, hammering it on the blade, and then annealing. What was annoying is that annealing sometimes changes the shape of the brass, so I could be mostly fit up and just need a little bit more plasticity to get it flush, and then after annealing it would just close up and I would have to reopen it and redo it. I'm honestly thinking that I needed a good bit of luck for this process to work, but after a couple hours I finally got it to sit mostly flush. With the habaki fit up and shrewd on the disc sander, it was time to mill out the little slot where the spine would be. This notch is called the muni machi and literally means spine notch. I don't really know why this notch exists, but what I do know is that without it, the habaki just looks a little bit off. The next thing that I had to do was create the machigane, or the small wedge that sits on the blade side. This is a really important structural piece because if I were to solder the habaki as is, there would be nothing filling that joint, and also nothing for that blade shoulder to sit on. To make my machigane, I cut out a small rectangular piece of brass, and then I took it over to my grinder and carefully shaved material off until it perfectly fit the negative space where it's supposed to be.
I need it to taper a little bit more and then it's good. I'm going to not make the same mistake I've made every other time I've soldered something and used too much solder. I'm only going to use one stick. All right, fingers crossed. All right, it'll be a good day if this fits all the way on. It almost wants to fit. Why are you not fitting on? It's crazy how far that little bit of solder goes. I've been drenching it every time before.
With the habaki now fully constructed and fit to the blade, the next thing on the to-do list is to give it a bit of a makeover. One of the interesting things about Rengoku's katana's habaki is that it's rounded out, and completely unlike the habaki I've made in the past. Shusui and my $8,000 Damascus katana both had a faceted habaki, so it was once again time to dive into some unknown territory. I started off by grinding facets just to keep everything symmetrical and easy to gauge by eye, but once the walls were thin enough, I carefully rounded out that facet. It actually almost hurt a little bit to do this because that facet took a lot of time to dial in, but I couldn't argue with the finished product.
That was the easy part, which is kind of sad because that took 4 hours. But now we got to do a 2-part habaki, and I've never done this, so this is going to be kind of interesting. Let's go to the whiteboard. All right, so our habaki kind of looks like something like this. And
what I want to do is get like a piece of copper on the outside right here in sort of a flame pattern. But in order to attach this to this, what I need to do is essentially cut off part of this habaki so that I have a piece that looks something like this that's gone from the main habaki. And then when I use this, solder on those pieces of copper on both sides. And then this slots onto that. All right, imagine that on this copper. It might be too complicated. Maybe I'll like simplify them a little bit. Okay, I think this is the pattern I'm gonna go with for what I'm gonna carve out of the copper. Now the only problem is that I need to scale this so that it prints perfectly, that I can like put it on this and it'll be perfectly scaled to this. I think that might take a couple trials, but it shouldn't be too bad. All right, that took longer than I wanted it to, but that's perfectly sized to the copper piece that I have. And I'm just gonna cut them out, spray adhesive to this, and then spend the next however long with the jewelry saw cutting it out. I'm already off the line. Oh my God. All right, take two. Reason why that happened is definitely because dull blade and not because I suck. If I were to classify my preferred making style, I would say that I heavily lean towards having simpler refined planes with not too many organic shapes. I don't do any engraving, and I only recently just started playing around with file work. Cutting out this detailed flame pattern definitely falls into the category of stuff that I'm not used to or comfortable with, but one of my goals is to eventually integrate more organic shapes into my work, and I figured there was no better time to start than now. I also knew that Rengoku's katana is full of these organic shapes, so I just had to rip that band-aid off and get comfortable being uncomfortable. Oh, beautiful. This is gonna be right here eventually. Oh, that looks so good. With the first side done and looking great, all I had to do now was duplicate the part by cutting out another one. Alright, next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut out this section right here. Cutting these is really easy because this is just like a single sheet and I don't need to really worry about my angle too much. But for something like this, I have to stay straight up and down and make sure that this isn't like tilting. This next jewelry sawing operation was probably the most dreadful thing I had to do during this entire build. What I didn't know at the time was that my saw, being the cheapest one I could find on Amazon, was hot garbage. I think I ordered a bigger and better saw while I was cutting this piece out because it was just so bad. Now, one of the things that I wish I knew before doing this cut is that you're not supposed to use the bit that you cut out as the piece that attaches to those side pieces and slots into the main habaki. You're supposed to make a new piece that fits the gap. I wish I knew this because I cut it so that there's material going all the way around the slice, and that made the process much more stressful than it should have been. Nice. All right, it's a little ugly. My saw cut wasn't straight at all, so I spent a little time cleaning up my lines with a file. These surfaces would eventually be covered, but they would affect how well the two habaki pieces seat, and I figured that was pretty important. Okay, so it's been a little bit of time since last filming. This original piece that I cut out, I've decided is way too small, so I spent a little bit of time off camera making an equivalent one out of copper that's just a little bit thicker, and I did it in the exact same way that I made the habaki, like wrap it around the tang, solder it, and as you can see, it fits basically perfectly now. There's not any gap over here, there's really no gap over here, which means that after I solder the plates to this, everything's gonna fit super, super snug. It should be better than the piece I cut out. I think this is actually the way you're traditionally supposed to do it. I didn't know that when I started, but now I do. With this little copper piece fit, it was finally time to bend the other copper flame pieces into shape and get everything soldered together. These side pieces have to be soldered in the exact position that they sit on the habaki. So what I did was I used some of this wire to hold everything together. The idea was that with the pressure from the wire, I could just pluck the part off, solder it, and everything would just work.
Okay, now take this off. Ha ha ha! Okay. It'll be tight, but it'll go back on. All right, I just need to solder it exactly like this. I don't know if it went in. All right. My hopes and dreams, please, please, please. Okay, it is extremely dirty, but... Okay, yeah, I have some filing to do. Watch the magic. Okay, it's not going on all the way. I think I need to remove like a drop of solder somewhere, but that's pretty good. I actually had nightmares about making this. That's actually crazy. Oh my god, that took so much time. But yeah, that is the first main step of this project done. And now it's on to a bunch of other steps that are also very complicated. All right, it's time to move on to the guard / Seppa area. I'm gonna be doing something very interesting here, because one of the key features is the yellow, the red, and the orange. Orange I can get with just copper, right? This red I can achieve with a very special copper patina, and this yellow right here I can just achieve with brass. So essentially I'm gonna have like, okay, imagine this is a flame. I'm gonna carve a little recess right here. So this area is gonna be sort of chiseled inward, which is gonna be interesting. And then this right here, I'm gonna make a spacer in the shape of a flame so that I can get that 3-color effect.
Before I could begin work on the guard and the spacers, also known as the Tsuba and the Seppa, I had to design their actual shapes. I used a couple anime frames as a reference, drew an initial shape, and then kept adjusting it to look good. There were a few details that I had to keep in mind though. On the Tsuba, there are a lot of small areas in between those flame tendrils, and those areas would be essentially impossible to sand if they were smaller than a certain radius. Another thing was that I had to scale everything so that all the dimensions made sense. It's really easy to draw a shape that looks good, but equally difficult for it to make sense as a physical object.
I got it printed out in size. This is exactly 3 inches across, but my material's not here yet. I know that I'm gonna have to do some sort of chiseling, and I don't have the correct chisels made. So what I'm gonna do while I wait for the copper sheet to arrive is make the chisels for that I'm gonna use later.
This point marks the beginning of my journey into the world of Japanese engraving. If you've seen any videos from That Works or Man-at-Arms, then you've probably seen Ilya carve intricate designs into his pieces. What he's doing is a lot more complex than what I plan to do here, but all in all, it uses the same fundamental techniques. My friend Ian from the YouTube channel Ian Z Forge actually studied under Ilya for a bit, and he was kind enough to give me some tips on creating my chisels. One of the things that he said that I thought was pretty interesting was that you can do 99% of Japanese engraving with just 2 chisels, a line chisel and a flat chisel, and those are what I'm making here. If you're curious, the steel that I'm using is W2, the same steel that I forged the katana from. My chisels were done now, but my copper sheet still hadn't arrived for the guard, so I decided that I was going to work on the Seppa. I mentioned that these were going to be made of brass to get that yellow color, and after cutting out my material, it was time to fit them to my tang. The great thing about making the Habaki first is that it makes scribing the exact shape of the tang really easy for adjacent pieces. It took like 10 hours to make, but at least now I had a perfect stencil.
Dude, this thing is actually... I'm not even close to the line that I want to be cutting. I'm actually gonna crash the...
Don't crash out, bro. You're on camera.
Yeah, at this point in the process, I was getting really sick and tired of my jewelry saw. The slot is such an awkward shape, and the jewelry saw was the fastest method. I wanted my fit up to be perfect though, so the plan was to cut closely inside the scribe line and then file later, but the saw wandered so much that what was supposed to be a 30-minute operation took me over an hour.
Alright, it goes on. 3, 2, 1. 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 Alright, it goes on. 3, 2, 1 Now it's time to actually get it to shape. I can print out infinite of these, so I'm just gonna like cut this out real quick.
Using my paper template, I carefully shaped the first Seppa. This was pretty simple. I just cut off the bulk excess material with the bandsaw and then smoothed everything out with my grinder. Later on, I also deburred it with the file just so that I wouldn't accidentally cut myself.
Would you look at that? With a guard, some red, some detail. It's gonna be good, it's gonna be good.
The bottom Seppa is literally an exact copy of the first one, so I'm just going to speed through that process real quick. Both Seppa were finished now, and luckily enough for me, my copper sheet showed up while I was working on the second one. This meant that I could jump straight into making the guard while I was still in a bit of a rhythm. To get started, I cut out a piece on the bandsaw and then stuck on another printed stencil.
I think before I carve out any of the profile, I want to mark exactly where the slot's gonna be and fit this to the tang. Okay.
To get my guard to fit up to my tang, I decided to actually use my milling machine instead of the jewelry saw to remove the bulk material. The reason for this is because copper is a lot more sticky than something like brass and would likely clog up my saw blade. The piece was also much thicker than my Seppa at about 1/4 of an inch, and I didn't trust me and my terrible jewelry saw to cut straight at all.
There we go.
If we take a look at some more traditional katana guards, you'll probably see that the slots were much bigger than the tangs they sat on. I think that the reasoning for this was that katanas are sort of like people wearing clothes, and their fittings and saya could be swapped out depending on the occasion. With a larger tang slot, a guard could be more modular and be worn on different sword blades. The reason that I'm not leaving them big and fitting them exactly to the shape of my tang is partially because of my modern bladesmithing background, but this piece was also meant to be a one-off that wouldn't change its clothes.
Alright, I've unfortunately been here for 2 full hours filing, but I think it finally fits. Yes! Ha ha ha. That's pretty good.
With the slot in the guard perfectly fit to the tang, it was now time to profile it. The early process was pretty similar to how I did the Seppa, but because it was so much thicker, and also because copper transmits heat so fast, I had to intermittently cool the piece off with some aluminum plates that I bought to heat treat stainless steel. Once all of the bulk material was cut off, it was off to the grinder to clean up the lines, but for the smaller radiuses inside the flame tendrils, I had to get a little creative.
Because the platen is so thick, I can't actually get into these little crevices, but I have something else that I can use. I have this. And the platen on this is like 1/8 of an inch thick. So I should be able to clean up these lines with this.
This grinder is a 1x30 that I bought to film the beginner course, and even though it's a bit underpowered, it definitely came in clutch for this project here. I think I got it for like $70 on Amazon, and a lot of beginners starting off are probably going to be using something similar. My tip for you guys is to not cheap out on the abrasives. Bad abrasives on an underpowered grinder is a recipe for disaster. Don't give yourself a double negative at the start.
I think that's pretty good. I didn't necessarily get as deep as the drawing, but if you looked at it on the side, you'd never be able to tell. And in order to make my life easier polishing it later, I'm just gonna leave it like this. Oh yeah.
With my guard now roughly shaped, it was time to do some Japanese engraving. But before I could start, I needed to deburr my edges and scribe the shape of my Seppa onto the guard surface.
It would be really irresponsible to do Japanese engraving for the first time on this actual guard. So I'm gonna do some practice on this. A lot of people use pitch to mount their pieces when they do engraving, but I don't have pitch, so I'm gonna use hot glue. All right, to practice, I'm gonna engrave this shape twice. All right, this first one is definitely gonna look like it, but the hope is doing it more than once will allow it to be better on the final piece. That's pretty deep. I guess that's what I want. Damn, this looks good. All right, what I'm realizing right now is that having a swivel base is really important because it's always better to hammer toward yourself. So what I think I'm gonna do before I work on the actual one is turn this square block underneath into a circle so I can just like rotate it willy-nilly in the vise. Yeah, right now, honestly, as a first try, this does not look bad at all. My depth got a little deep here, and doing this curve was a little bit meh, but that line looks really good. This line looks really good.
After a little bit of practice with the line chisel, I could pretty easily change the depth of cut and follow curved lines, so I decided that it was time to move on to practicing with the flat chisel. One of the things I immediately noticed was that the angle I had put on my chisel tip was way too obtuse. I had to hit harder than I would have liked, and the process was fairly slow. Now, the great thing about making my own chisels was that I could go over to my grinder and change the geometry whenever I wanted, so that's exactly what I did. I also took this time and did what I mentioned earlier and rounded out my holding block.
I think I'm done with practice. First one was, this one looks a lot better. I feel like I do things better with stuff on the line, so I think what I'm gonna do is move on to the final piece. I'm gonna start on the bottom side because the bottom side is less important. All right, it begins. Okay, not a bad start. Alright, apparently my chisel is sharp enough to where I can just like clean up the lines by just pushing it. I didn't know this was possible. But I'm essentially just whittling copper. See that? It makes the lines so much cleaner, and I don't need to worry about like overdoing it with a hammer or something.
This line engraving process was probably one of the most satisfying things I've ever done. The only problem was that once I was about an hour in, my hands started shaking. I talked a bit with Ian, and apparently the best way to fix this, according to Ilya, is to drink some vodka. I didn't have any vodka on hand at the time, so I decided to just push through it instead.
Oh, that's so fun.
With these two lines set, it was time to use the flat chisel and carve that channel. The line work took me about 3-ish hours to do on both sides, but I knew that compared to the flat chisel work, it was going to be nothing. In terms of raw area, the channel already far exceeds the area of the lines, but it also needs to reach a minimum depth to ensure I could isolate the red patina. It might be a little bit hard to visualize why this is the case, but once we get to it later, it'll make a lot more sense. In a lot of ways, patience is like a muscle. Throughout my bladesmithing journey, I've done a lot of different processes, and honestly, for the most part, you can do the vast majority of them in a hurry and sort of just rush through them. There are steps, though, that are physically impossible to rush. One example is hand sanding. You either have a good hand sanded finish, or you don't. Another one is carving a slot in a wooden saya. The blade either fits or it doesn't. This step right here of chiseling out the channel in the guard is by far the one that's targeted my patience muscle the most. I knew it had to be done, but the progress was really slow. I ended up having to get into sort of a zen state where I wasn't thinking about finally having it done, and more so just enjoying the process.
My outside like lines are a tiny bit messy. In all honesty, if I went forward with like the reddening process right here, nobody would notice. But I want to crispen up the lines a little bit. And what I'm doing is just taking my line chisel and just like going back across the outside. And it's leaving like a pretty nice border here. So I'm just going to do that on all of these lines, and then we'll start texturing. All right, that wasn't too bad. One of the benefits of this, aside from looking super cool, is that there's no more burrs. Before I did this, all of these corners were sort of sharp and I didn't know how I was going to clean them up. But after doing this, like, there's no more burr.
The flat chisel left a finish that wasn't super pleasing to the eye, so I decided to go in with a ball texturing punch that I got from my friend Korn to give it a better texture. This big one that I'm using here I used for the bulk, but I used a smaller one to clean up the edges.
Oh yeah, I discovered an alternate way to do this, which is just to take the punch and just... Okay, yeah, that looks pretty good.
think I'm done. Only problem is I have to do it all again on the other side, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think next thing we do is just try it on the sword to see how it looks. Oh. Ooh, that already looks pretty sick. All right, the next two things that I want to work on are the Fuchi and the Kashira. And these are a lot more complicated than any other ones that I've done. If you look like real closely, it's kind of hard to tell whether the brass is over the copper or vice versa. But what I'm going to do is, most of it's going to be made out of copper, and then I'm going to add a brass flame colored thing to the outside of that, solder everything together, and that'll be the Fuchi. And for the Kashira, the brass doesn't really appear on the side, so it's more like two pieces soldered on each side. But I can't tell if it's intentional, so I might do the same thing as this and do it all the way around with brass. If you've seen any of my past katana videos, you'll probably notice that I'm doing things in a slightly different order this time. Normally I would carve and shape the handle first, and then make the Fuchi and the Kashira to fit that, but this time I'm doing the opposite. Looking back at some of my previous builds, I feel like my handles ended up a little bit too thick, and my thinking was that if I made the Fuchi and Kashira first, using the dimensions of a properly sized handle, I'd be forced to build the handle to those dimensions instead of gradually letting it grow larger than intended. To do this, I spent a good amount of time measuring the katana that Sortis sent me in the last video, and then I used those measurements to make a wooden mandrel to form the Fuchi and the Kashira. Hopefully this works. I decided to make the base copper layer from a piece of 1mm thick copper plate. This is thicker than the sheet I used for my past Fuchi, but I wanted the handle ornaments on this piece to have a bit more oomph. Now, because I made the wooden mandrel, I had to use slightly different techniques, and rather than purely bending like I've done in the past, I tried to employ some hammering around the mandrel, sort of like how an armorer would work on sheet metal. The question is how I close this without closing this. I don't have a good idea for that, so I'm just going to do this. That did not work. It's so close. I think there's slightly too much material. Okay, so I have the Fuchi like 99% to shape, and one of the important things is that I don't have to like tension it to solder it, like it's holding its shape already. But there's one piece that I still need to make that I've never made before, and essentially just like a super thin piece of copper to help support that bond, so I'm gonna do that. Before making this video, I made sure to study some videos on YouTube regarding more traditional techniques. What I found was that before soldering the Fuchi, they hammered a really paper-thin piece of copper to put on the inside of the Fuchi for extra support. I didn't see a reason for me to not do this, so I tried it out here. Oops. Yeah, that'll work. Solder, please work. Please. Oh. Okay, that worked. I'm gonna have to file some of that out, but I think that worked. The joint was now soldered, but like always, I used way too much solder. I spent some time with an assortment of files to remove that excess solder, and once that was done, I put it back on my mandrel to ensure the shape was perfect. This worked for the most part, but I actually managed to get it stuck, and in order to get it off, I had to take it over to my vise and hammer it off. All right, it's time for me to design this like brass part right here. But what I can't figure out is whether the flames are supposed to be like flaming this way or flaming this way. It would make sense for the flames to be going away from the guard. But if I were to do that, that means I sort of need to cut out brass that's the negative of the flame and then overlay it. But then if you go to like this picture right here, the flames go the other way. So I need to decide which way I want them to go like right now. Okay, so I took the flame design that I put on the Habaki and then simplified it a tiny bit, made a whole line of it. The idea is that now
This is sort of like modular, and however much I need, I can just cut out however much, put it on some brass and cut it out, and it should work. I just need to find a way to print it and scale it correctly now. Okay, I got a fun new toy. This is the jewelry saw that I've been using, which is like the cheapest one I could find on Amazon. And this is my new one. Auto tension, whatever, super rigid, 5 inches of depth so I can cut like super big stuff. And it's really light. This is gonna be really fun to use.
This section of the Fuchi was probably one of the things that I spent the most time thinking about how to do. I could have chosen to either carve a simple flame pattern onto the copper or even ignore it altogether, but I felt like both of those would have been a disservice to the detail the anime clearly wanted to show. Now, this flame pattern that I drew and laid onto the brass wasn't necessarily more complicated than the one I put on the Habaki, but since it had to wrap around the entire circumference of the Fuchi, I needed the cut to be more consistent and even. I'm happy to say though that this new jewelry saw that I got made this process so much easier than I expected. My brother was always making fun of me for blaming my saw for my jagged cuts, but once I showed him that I could cut exactly on the line with this new saw, I felt pretty vindicated.
There we go. And I also realized both of these are usable if I wanted to do the negative and if I wanted to do the positive, so didn't really need to think about it.
With my brass now cut, I spent some time deburring it, and then I began to fit it to my copper piece. I was going to be soldering it to the copper, but the solder I used is silver, which is a different color from both my copper and the brass piece, so I spent a lot of time ensuring that the fit up was as perfect as it could be. One thing that came up was that I made my brass piece slightly too long, so I took it over to my jewelry saw and cut off the excess.
Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I'm gonna wrap it in wire and then we'll solder it. But I'm only gonna solder like the bottom, because like some of these teeth didn't like bend in and I need to like hammer those in. All right, hope this goes well.
This solder that I'm using is a lead-free silver solder from Stay Bright. It's worked pretty well for me in the past, but it's a lower temperature solder that I think is inferior to something like fine silver solder. This was the most complicated soldering job I had ever done though, and it seemed to turn out alright. After cooling it down, I took it over to my mandrel and hammered it a bit, and it didn't come apart, and after that I ground off some of the gunk on the outside. As you can see here, it looks pretty damn good even before cleaning the insides of the flames, which had me pretty optimistic. The last part of the Fuchi that I had to make was that small copper piece that I would inset into the top. I scribed the inside of the Fuchi onto another piece of copper plate and carefully shaped it so that it perfectly fit the inside rim.
It's definitely in. Yeah, there we go. No satisfying sound, but that's 100% in.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention it, but even after all that bending, soldering, and sawing, I still had to cut the tang slot and file it to fit the tang itself. Now, on the surface level, this probably looks like it's super tedious, but to be honest, I've always wanted the opportunity to do this kind of work. I see bladesmiths making fittings that take longer to complete than it takes me to make an entire blade, and I can't help but envy their patience and attention to detail. I think one of the things that helped me on this project was the engraving I did on the guard. It forced me to slow down and warm up my patience muscle that I talked about earlier. This makes it so that work that I would have considered tedious is more lighthearted and less dreadful.
Yeah! That's pretty good. Alright, handle time.
A katana handle is called a Tsuka. It kind of sounds similar to Tsuba, which is the name for the guard, but it's very different. Now, the wood that I'm using here is just simple poplar. Some of you are probably thinking, dang, poplar is pretty light and low quality wood. But the traditional wood they used for saya was called honoki, which is also a really light porous wood. It's perfect because you don't want your saya to ever scratch your blade, and you also want it to be easy to carve because all of the fitting work is done with chisels.
Oh my god, it's so much easier than carving metal. It might be too easy, I don't want to go overboard.
I've always thought of knife making as a super versatile craft because to make a knife you need to be a welder, a blacksmith, and a woodworker. But doing something like this here, chiseling wood, I think is the purest form of woodworking that I do. I make wooden handles all the time, but usually it's just carving a slot, grinding, and a bit of hand sanding. This here though is much more down to earth, and I really feel feedback from the piece that I'm working on. See how this fits? Wow, we are nowhere close. Let's check again. Honestly, we're getting pretty close on the front. I think that's pretty good for one side. Comes in, fits up snug. But yeah, the first piece was carved and fit, so I took some more time and did the same carving on the other piece. One of the things I found is that it always feels faster and easier on the second one because I have a fully carved slot as a reference. Alright, if I slot this upper piece on and there's no more wiggle, that means we're good. Oh yeah, I think we're good. That's pretty good. No gap. Alright, time to glue it together. Before gluing the two sides together, I found that profiling one of them first is a good idea. If you think about it, once you glue the two sides together, you can't see the slot at all. So if you shape it knowing exactly where the slot is and knowing your wall thickness, it just makes everything easier. Now, one of the things that I come to realize is that a good katana handle is more than a parallel banana shape. It needs to be a bit of an hourglass. And the side of the handle on the same side as the edge needs to be much flatter than the top side. This means that it's less of a symmetrical hourglass and more of an hourglass that's been sitting in the sun and the middle starts to sag. So as I was profiling this handle, I had to keep all that in mind and ensure that the shape was right. Alright. Oh, that was smexy. Oh yeah, it's looking good. Alright, it's been a minute, the glue's cured. But there's a problem, like, look at this. I was too hasty to do the glue up, and this is off by like 1 degree. Look at it, it sort of looks like there's an angle right here as opposed to like a smooth curve. Right now it's like this, it wants to be like this. The only way for me to actually get it like this is unfortunately to carve an entirely new one. So I'm gonna go do that real quick. Actually, I've never done this. Smooth transition. I'm gonna have a new one on the blade in 3, 2, 1. Oh my gosh, it looks so much better. With the newly carved handle glued together, it was now time to shape it. Now, katana are two-handed swords, which means that the handle can't be too short or else it would be awkward to hold, but also can't be too long because you need to be nimble and quick. The average katana handle is usually between 10 and 12 inches, so I shot for the center at 11 inches in hopes that it would be a good balance of quick yet powerful. It looks pretty good. I already talked about how the optimal profile of a katana handle is supposed to be a saggy hourglass, but there's one other attribute of a katana handle that I've done wrong in the past that I want to talk about. This is a photo of a traditional katana handle done right, and this is a photo of my last katana, Shusui. Notice the difference? It might be hard to see at first, but the traditional one has the Ito wrap on the same level as the Fuchi, while mine was a bit higher. Obviously at the time I didn't notice it or even care, but now that I've noticed it, looking at Shusui makes me want to claw my eyes out. Now here's where it gets complicated. Generally, the walls of a Fuchi are fairly thin at about 1mm thick, but because I had brass overlaid on top of copper, my Fuchi was about 2mm thick. With a 1mm Fuchi, I would have to carve a recess into my Tsuka to house the Rayskin wrap so that the Ito wrap would be on the same level as the Fuchi, but since my Fuchi is 2mm thick, I wouldn't have to do that. Okay, that was a little more complicated than it had to be, so as a TLDR, just know that I want my final handle to look like this as opposed to this, and I have to pull a bunch of strings to make that happen. Guys, why is there a duck on my screen?
Oh, he's swimming.
Dude, what is this?
Where'd he go? No, he's gone.
Alright, the last thing that I need to make before I can like grind this section a little bit thinner and finish off this Tsuka is the Kashira right here. But I have a bit of a dilemma here because I'm not doing the Rengoku katana wrap because I really think that this plain right wrap is a disgrace to katana making. So I'm going to do a classic Ito wrap, which means that this right here is going to need a slot in it somewhere. Somewhere there needs to be a slot, which means the flames need to play around this. And I'm trying to think about what that should actually look like. This is, if I try to copy it exactly, it kind of looks like crap. So what I'm going to do is just do sort of a mirror image of the
the Fuchi.
For those of you who don't know what a Fuchi and Kashira are, they're simply just handle ornaments. The Fuchi is the piece that you saw me make earlier that sits on top of the handle right under the guard, and the Kashira is the mirroring piece that sits on the base of the handle. Now, the closest thing to a Kashira on a Western sword would be a pommel, but unlike a pommel, a Kashira is not supposed to act as a counterbalance. The process through which I made this Kashira is almost the exact same as the Fuchi, but because it's clearly taller than the Fuchi in the source material, I scaled all the pieces up so it was almost double the height. Now, you already sort of saw my thought process on how I designed the Kashira, and I feel like it shows one of the most complicated parts of making these anime builds. It's not super hard to make a piece that looks somewhat like the original, and I also feel like it's only marginally harder to make an exact replica. The difficult thing to do, in my opinion, is combining the artistic decisions of the animation team with real-life tradition and modern materials, and that's the part I'm still trying to figure out. Alright, we just finished that, which means both of the handle ornaments are mostly done. Boom! That already looks pretty sick. There's one thing I have to figure out before everything is said and done, which is there's a lot of excess solder that I got on some of these parts. And from what I hear, the only way to get it off is with like a wire wheel, so I'm probably going to have to find some attachments to put on my Dremel. For now, with a rough finish, I think they look pretty damn good. The next item on the list, and actually the last major structural component of the build, was the saya. If a katana's fittings are its clothes, then the saya is its house. If you think about it, every handmade katana is unique. One blade might pick up a slightly different curve during the quench, and another could have subtle variations in its geometry. No matter how careful the smith is, no two blades can be exactly the same. And because of this, every saya has to be made specifically for the blade it will house. The wood that I'm using for this saya is once again poplar, and it's a good thing that it's a softer wood because the sheer volume of wood that I need to carefully remove is pretty astounding compared to when I carved the handles. I'd wager that even though I had to carve 2 sets of handles, the total volume of wood I had to remove is still around half the volume of this one saya. Sit for a little bit and carve the other one. I think I've talked about it in one of my other videos, but woodworking is pretty freaking hard. If you chip something out, there's only so much you can do to fix it. But in metalworking, if you make a mistake, you can probably just add some weld bead. The slip up I did earlier luckily didn't completely chip out, so I just added some wood glue, clamped it, and worked on the other side. I don't know why, but this lighter section of wood is like 5 times denser than this section right here. Like, look at this. So smooth. Try to do the same thing here. Like, what the heck? You see that? I would say that there are 3 main things that you need to keep in mind when carving a Japanese saya like this. The first thing is the overall depth and accurateness of the channel. If it's too big, the blade will probably wiggle around, which is no good, and if it's too small, the blade won't slide in smoothly. The second thing is this little notch at the bottom. I don't know the traditional name for this, but its job is to collect the excess dust and oil that would otherwise scratch and tarnish the blade. I like to call it the sewer system of the saya. I wouldn't necessarily say it's super difficult to carve, but if you forget to do it, then how are you going to get to it later? The last thing to keep in mind is that in order to offer the best protection for the blade, the saya needs to essentially be airtight. The way that you get this seal is that you need to carefully carve the opening of the saya to exactly fit the habaki. Usually I do this part last, but past Jesse got a bit tired, so we switched the order around a little bit. Okay, I give up on fitting it before fitting the habaki, so I'm going to fit the habaki and then fit the rest of it. As you can see from the floor here, I've been here for a hot minute. I am like really scared of going past this line. Okay, that was really stressful because I was scared I would chip out something and have to restart. But
That fits pretty damn well, all things considered.
it's like pretty tight on these two ends right here. But there's like a little bit of gap right here. But that's actually how it's supposed to be traditionally done. There's supposed to be contact on the sides, like these sides right here. But here and right here, you're supposed to leave a tiny bit of gap. So the only pressure comes from the sides. And that's what it looks like right here. Okay, all that was left to do was the same on the opposite side, but I won't bore you with that. That took freaking forever. But watch this. Habaki nests perfectly into that half, right? Perfectly, barely any gap. And then you take this one. Wow! 0 gap. With the Habaki fit, it was time for the final little bit of detail work. In the same way that you would fit a key to a power hammer by marking and seeing what parts are contacting, I marked my blade with permanent marker to see what areas of the saya were contacting. I would put the coated blade into the saya, look for marker marks on the wood, and then simply carve those exact spots. Now, I'd wager that traditional saya carvers didn't have permanent markers, but they actually did something very similar. They would coat their blades in oil, put them in the sheath, and then look for shiny spots on the wood. Alright, it's taken like 10 separate cycles, but now I think it's exactly how I want it. So it goes in pretty smoothly at the beginning, there's a good amount of wiggle, but then as you get to the end, it takes a little bit more pressure, and then it seats. But it's not just the blade fit up that I'm worried about. With the Habaki on, it goes the same until the Habaki gets there, and then there's a lot of friction. That's exactly what I want because the Habaki is meant to be the seal to prevent the blade from coming out. See, a lot of force is required for it to come out, but if I really want to pull it out, just use my thumb and it comes out. With the saya carved, it was once again time to profile one of the sides in preparation for glue up. I was definitely a little bit stressed for this because one wrong move and I'd have to redo 2 full days of work, but a little bit of stress is never a bad thing. One of the things I had to keep in mind during this profiling is that the saya shouldn't be super wide at all. Maybe in a couple frames of the anime, the saya looks wider than I'm shaping here, but I'm just attributing that to artistic motion blur, and I'm going to do what feels right. Alright, hopefully that's enough clamps. Before gluing the saya, I sprayed a little bit of this Japanese blade oil onto the inside of the sheath. The thinking behind this was that steel likes to rust, so it was going to be heavily oiled when everything was all said and done anyway. I was going to get a head start on this by putting some oil in the saya so that the dry wood wouldn't suck the oil off the blade early on. Okay, it's gonna be a lot of glue. Oh my gosh, so many clamps. Very nice. Alright, the question is if the blade still goes in. Oh yeah, this is what it looks like with everything on right now. Pretty freaking sick. And this is just preliminary of what everything looks like. The colors are going to be very different and everything's going to be slightly more shiny. So, yeah, let's see. Okay. Yeah, okay, that's good. As it stands, this saya is probably the ugliest thing in my shop, so my next goal is to shape it and get it looking pretty in preparation for painting and making even more ornaments. This process is largely the same as me shaping the handle, just on a larger scale, so I'm not going to show you too much of it, but it was essentially me cutting off the excess material on my bandsaw, finalizing the profile on my grinder, and then changing to the slack belt and rounding everything out. Alright, so now that I have the saya shaped, I need to worry about the last 2 fittings on this thing.
which is these collars on the tip and the back of the saya. There doesn't seem to be too much detail in these, so I'm just going to make them out of plain brass. However, what I'm going to do for the one at the bottom is I'm going to, like, this is a fan art, but I'm assuming that this goes like this on the bottom. So rather than a collar that just goes like this, there's lips right here. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to first make a collar that's even distance about this tall, and then just grind that in.
One of the more commonly overlooked parts of a katana saya is something called a koiguchi. Traditionally, it was a flush fit collar that you added to the lip of the saya, and it was made from a more wear-resistant material like buffalo horn. Now, Rengoku's katana has a koiguchi, but it's very obviously made of metal. So what I did was I took some brass, bent it around the lip of the saya, and essentially made a larger version of my fuchi. The annoying thing, once again, about this process is that the blade needs to be able to go into the saya, which means I needed to bust out the jewelry saw again and file it to fit the habaki perfectly. I mentioned earlier that there was a collar at the base of the saya as well, so after filing and shaping the slot in the first one, I spent some time off camera making the other piece. This was literally the same exact process as making the koiguchi, so I didn't decide to film it. The part that I did choose to film though was adding that radius to the bottom of the piece. I did this with a small wheel attachment on the grinder, and overall it was fairly simple to do, but I had to make sure that I was grinding perpendicular and not more off one side. I'm not going to push it on all the way yet, but there's that piece, there's this piece. So all the ornaments on this are done, except for the, whatever that thing's called. Ah, yeah. This is all the pieces. And look, it goes in all the way. Oh yeah. Okay, so I was up late thinking about this last night, and for the most part, all of this is ready for like final embellishments and stuff. But there's one little detail that has been keeping me from falling asleep, which is the alignment from this handle to the teeth. This side, it's like almost in the same plane, but this side there's like an offset, and that just doesn't look right. And I want to try and fix that. And I was trying to think of all the ways to fix it. I can take off, and I measured it. 2 millimeters on this side, and it should perfectly be centered to this. The only thing I would have to remake then is this fuchi. And since I have more experience making this and like all of these caps on the saya, it should take a lot less time. And I think it'll be worth it because then I won't have to be like thinking about this as it goes off to the client and like, oh, I could have done it better. So. All right, new one is made. Honestly, this one turned out a lot better than the first one. Let's see how it lines up. I haven't seen this yet. That is much better. Yeah, that is much better. Okay, now I can stop thinking about that. Now that I was happy with the ornaments and the overall alignment of the entire blade, it was time for the Rayskin wrap. One of the things that some of you might feel is a bit off is that the canon Rengoku handle does not show any Rayskin. It also doesn't even have an Ito wrap, and just has a plain white cord wrap that is completely unlike any katana handle that I've ever seen. If I were to be trying to make a perfect replica, I wouldn't even bother to do this Rayskin wrap, but I felt like it would almost be sacrilegious to not do this or the Ito wrap. So the plan for the handle was to forego the design in the anime, keep the color theme, and do a more traditional handle. I have a sneaking suspicion that not too many of you are going to be sad about this. So now this is exactly the area of this. And now I can just put this on my Rayskin. Speaking of Rayskin, nice vibrant red. Oh yeah, look at that. These are called the Emperor nodes, and as you can see, all of these, there's like a bunch of like tiny nodes surrounding it, and there's like a patch of big nodes right in the center here. I think when I dyed this Rayskin, they like either didn't paint it or like they did something weird to it. But these are the Emperor nodes, and these are gonna be on the left side of my handle near the bottom, which is right here. So I can sort of just tape this on. Wow, this stuff is really difficult to mark with a Sharpie because it's not a flat surface. Stingray skin is fairly flexible and might look even soft, but in actuality, every single one of those nodes is quite hard. In fact, the individual nodes are very similar to your teeth, high in calcium with an outer enamel layer. This makes cutting it extremely difficult. The scissors that I used were the same ones that I used for leatherworking, and yes, I know for you leatherworkers this is almost painful to look at, but the alternative was using a worse pair of scissors and spending a whole hour cutting.
Ah, nice.
I got pretty close to the shape that I needed with scissors, but there was a bit more I had to do before I could glue the skin to the handle. The first thing was that I needed to thin it down just a little bit to ensure that the final handle looked right, but I also needed to make it slightly smaller on the top and the bottom. The problem with the scissors is that they can only cut in between the nodes, and I needed to be more accurate than that, so I went over to the grinder, put the skin on a small piece of wood to prevent it from getting pulled in, and shaped it that way.
What's the plan? Plan is lots of glue. Am I ready for this? Oh god, this is... Oops, I put it on backwards. All the glue is like dry. Shut up! I don't need your patronism. Oh my gosh, that was stressful.
With the Rayskin on, and honestly all of the pieces of the katana made except for one, I decided to hand sand my blade. Actually, I call it hand sanding, but half of this process was actually done without sandpaper and with these small diamond stones. Reason being, a katana has very precise geometry, and even though I'm good at grinding, there were small tweaks that I had to make before I could start polishing. These diamond stones have a much harder backing and are aggressive enough for me to really make changes to my geometry. The first bit of geometry that I worked on was the very tip. In a Shinogi Zukuri katana, one of the defining features is the yokote line, and I needed the line to be extremely crisp. One of the ways that I've heard this line described was the face of your katana. It's the first thing your opponent sees, so you want it to be beautiful.
You see, even at 220 grit here, the Hamon is like very, very apparent. Something that was really stressing me out was the quality of my yokote. Like, it's supposed to be convex ground, but it's really, really hard to get a nice yokote with two convex like lines right here, unless you do like a stone polish. So what I did is, even though I hand sanded the tips on both sides, I went back to the grinder and I reground these with a slight flat at that transition, just so I get that nice crisp yokote. And from this point, it'll be much easier to make it look like a traditional yokote. So yeah, I'm very happy I did that, and I didn't wait until I went to like 600. All right, even just at 400 grit, look how much more crisp that yokote is. That is freaking sexy.
In the past, whenever I've sanded blades with Hamons, I only went to 600 grit. It's a great balance of a fine enough finish and also not spending 2 whole days sanding. For this piece though, I wanted to go a bit higher with a 1000 grit finish. I was still playing around with the idea of doing a Hadori polish, and I needed a much higher finish to do that. You're probably wondering though, Jesse, it's just 1000 grit, it's one more piece of sandpaper, how much more of a difference can that be? But this one extra grit adds time almost exponentially. The finer your sandpaper grit, the faster it wears out and the slower it cuts. For a piece like this that I already put so much time into though, I felt like it was worth it.
Okay, it's taken more than a real life day, but we're done with 400 grit.
It wouldn't make sense to go to 1000 grit immediately and risk scratching my finish, so for this stage of hand sanding, I decided to have 600 grit as my endpoint. Eventually, once I got there, I sprayed some fluid film on my blade to prevent rust, and then I covered it in masking tape to prevent scratches.
This used to be my hand sanding chair. I stood up for like 2 seconds, and then Marlo stole it, so I used this black chair, and then I come back after eating some food, and now Dulce's taking it. The last structural piece, on most katana saya, you're gonna have something like this, and it's essentially how the saya actually attaches to like your waist when you want to carry it. And it's very important that I make this now before I paint the saya. So traditionally, this part is made from horn, and I have one right here. This is actually a dog chew toy I got off Amazon because I didn't know really like where else to source it from. But it's hollow right here, which is confusing to me. But I'm assuming that like from here up until here, it's pretty solid. So I'm just gonna like cut off a chunk here and then figure out how I'm gonna shape it.
Cutting into this piece of buffalo horn was pretty interesting. The first thing that I noticed was that the smell that came off was pretty pungent and almost smelled like manure. The second thing was that it was impossible to tell where the horn became one solid piece, so I ended up dissecting and choosing a portion of the horn that was all on one side to avoid any cracking. Part of me was scared that my portaband here wouldn't be able to cut it, but it cut it just fine. It just was a little bit slow and it smelled really bad. One of the things I don't want to do with this material is grind it too much, because if it smelled that bad when I was cutting it, I don't want to know what it'll smell like when I inevitably burn it on the belt. So what I'm going to do is sketch out what I want to shape it to, and then cut off most of it on the saw. All right, I think we'll make it 1.35 inches. This little saya ornament that I'm making here is called the Kurigata. Earlier I mentioned that they're traditionally made from buffalo horn, but there were historical examples also made from wood and metal. Now, the purpose of this Kurigata is to hold the Sageo wrap, which is the cord used to attach the katana to the wearer's belt for carrying. And one funny problem that I ran into was that I couldn't find a single frame in the anime that actually showed Rengoku's Kurigata. This meant that I had no idea what the shape was or what the color it was supposed to be. So everything that I'm doing here is a bit of an educated guess, but I feel that the black horn with the rounded profile fit the overall design of the saya pretty well. In terms of rounding out this Kurigata, I was a little conflicted on the final shape because the two katana that I had two Kurigata with very different shapes. I ended up deciding that the best thing to do was to combine the elements of both and leave the top fairly round, but also to leave the facet where the round meets the flat. I did the bulk shaping with my grinder, but I ended up deciding to finalize everything with files because, aside from the buffing machine, the belt grinder is the #1 tool in the shop that can just take what you're grinding and throw it away, and I didn't want to drop it on the floor. Okay, so this isn't fully shaped yet, but what I want to do now while I still have these crisp corners is scribe and carve the slot into the saya, because as you can see right now, the edges are up, and I want to inset it so it's flush. And technically I could carve this round so that it sits flush, but I don't think that's how it's traditionally done. I wanted this Kurigata inset to be almost perfect, and I decided that the best way I could get this started was with my jewelry saw. It allowed me to cut perfectly straight lines, and I could gauge exactly where I wanted it to be with my fingernail.
Oh my god, this is so scary. Oh, imagine I just completely blow out the corner. Yeah, I don't like this. I'm using a different method. I was a little paranoid about hitting the sides there, so hopefully that tape will help. Oh yeah, the fact that you can hear that means we're getting there. Okay. I think that's pretty good. Watch this. The slot is that's probably the cleanest filed slot that I've ever done. I can slot it in and it doesn't fall out.
With all of the structural components of this sword made, it was now time to move on to some finer details. The first thing I decided to do was to carve the slot in my Kashira and my Tsuka. I think that this slot is pretty interesting because in the vast majority of anime, they don't even bother to show how the Ito wrap interacts with the Kashira. They sort of end up just sitting next to each other. In reality though, this end knot on the Ito wrap necessitates a slot for the cord to pass through. Now, I'm not technically even going all the way here and making two more structural pieces that are supposed to be inserted into this slot like how Ilya did here, but I gotta leave something new for a future katana video if I make one, right? Anyways, with this slot carved, it was now time for me to move on to something that I was stressing about a lot. Polishing the flames on the Fuchi and the Kashira. Hopefully, okay. I'm gonna have to wear some really good safety glasses because I guarantee you these are gonna go flying everywhere. Oh, I don't need it. Oh! These are Scotch-Brite wheels for getting into small places. All right, there's a lot of excess solder underneath this brass. And technically it kind of looks a little bit cool, but I want to try and remove as much of it as I can. And hopefully this wire wheel on this Dremel will help me do that. Oh, that works, even at such a low speed. Oh yeah, that works so well. It's like brushing your teeth. Look at that. This side with a minute of wire brushing compared to this side.
I still haven't used the Scotch-Brite wheel, I haven't used the brass wheel. This is just off the wire wheel, and it looks so clean already. Oh yeah.
With all of the excess solder successfully removed, the last step that I wanted to do to these was to polish them a little bit. I decided that the easiest way to polish the brass on the outside was with a regular surface conditioning belt, but on the interior in between the flames, I still used the little Scotch-Brite Dremel wheels.
That actually looks not bad.
I think that looks pretty good. In the past, what I've tried to do is get a mirror finish on literally everything. But in hindsight, I think it looks a lot worse. And this isn't just like me being like lazy. Like if you look at Ilya's work, he doesn't go for a mirror polish on any of his fittings, but it looks so refined. And I feel like there's a balance between like having a polish and actually having it look good. And I think this is in a good enough spot for me to call it. As I polish my Seppa and Habaki, I want to circle back to something that I mentioned much earlier in the video, where I said, did the smiths back in the day even know what a quote-unquote real katana was? This question came up when I was talking with my friend Ian about Japanese engraving. I mentioned that I was scared that some of my earlier katana might have been too thick, and that I wasn't sure if my dimensions were historically accurate. Ian told me that he recently had the chance to handle some more traditional katana, and one of the things that immediately stood out to him was how heavy some of them were, and in general, how much variance they had in design. This got me thinking. Nowadays, people are very quick to tell you what a real sword should be. It has to be thin, it has to be light, it has to fit within a certain range of measurements. If it's not quote-unquote perfectly historically accurate, someone will probably tell you that it's a fake sword. But we have something that historical smiths never had: the internet and access to pictures of swords from across hundreds or even thousands of years of history. We can study them, we can measure them down to probably a tenth of a millimeter, we can compare them, and using all this information, build a framework for what we think a sword should be. If you think about it though, the smiths who originally made these swords didn't have that luxury. They learned through apprenticeships and maybe through occasional traveling. They weren't sitting there and worrying about whether their blade was half a millimeter too thick or that their sword was a centimeter too long. They made these weapons to live, and most likely thought about bladesmithing in a much less restrictive way than we do now. I don't know, I've been thinking about this for a while, so if you have any thoughts on this, feel free to put them in the comments. I'm very curious as to what you guys think. With my Seppa and Habaki polished, it was now time to move on to the guard. The guard on Rengoku's katana is one of the centerpieces of the build, so comparatively, I wanted to give it a much finer finish. Later, I was going to be doing a heat patina to turn the channel that I carved out red, but in hopes of getting the best finish on it after the coloring, I decided to get everything to a nice 220 grit hand sanded finish beforehand. Okay, so it's time to put the red coloring onto the guard, and I'm on like jewelry forums, and a lot of people say to heat it up and then quench it in borax water, but some other people are saying to like put flux on here and then heat it up. I don't really know what to do. The one that I've been thinking of doing is the borax water, but I'm scared to try any of it because there's like 20 hours of work into this, and if I mess it up, then it's really bad. Okay, I think I have a recipe that will work. Step 1, boil water with 55 grams of borax to 1 liter of distilled. Apparently in the video that I watched, you need to boil it, but you don't need to keep it boiling when you quench it. So we're just gonna boil the water with the borax and then let it cool down. And then step 2, we're gonna heat up the copper to, I think it was around 1,000 degrees Celsius. I'm not gonna be too like rigid on the temperature there because I'm really scared of melting this. So I'll just get it up to like a red heat, maybe like a orange at most. And then we're gonna quench. But the problem is I don't really have a nice tall container to hold the water, because I'm gonna be holding it with like a wire through the hole that I'm gonna put the tang, which means the guard is gonna look like this. And I want a good amount of headway underneath it in the container. So I need to get a nice glass container that's not too wide, but also really deep. And I think I'm gonna get that at like an art store. So I'm gonna go do that real quick. Okay, I got a container. It is the right width and it should be tall enough. And the thing I have to boil the water is this old pan. Okay, that's about 1 liter, I want more than that. All right, that's about 2 liters of water exactly. I don't really think I need to fill it up more, so I think 2 liters is good, which means I need 110 grams of borax. Yes! Alright, hopefully this lights. Okay, I'm using the blowtorch. Nice. Oh yeah, that's perfect. Okay, let's put in the water. Okay, borax in. I want this to basically be clear. Alright, technically I don't know if it has to reach a boil, but I'm gonna let it go past a boil just in case that's a requirement. Okay, this should work. Alright, so I should just be able to put this through here, heat it up like this, and then when I need to dip it, just go like dip. Damn! This is a good hook. Nice, exactly at that 2 liter mark. Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. At this point, I had everything ready for this patina process. I had my borax water mixture, my container, and my holding stick. So all that was left to do was to heat up the guard and quench it into that mixture. I set my forge to be extremely reducing and even put a brick on the other side so that all of the dragon's breath would go one way, and this was all in hopes that the copper wouldn't oxidize. This little discoloration that you see on the outside when I held the torch to the guard wasn't necessarily the best sign, but I figured it shouldn't have been too much of an issue, and I decided to go forward with the quenching.
Okay, what do I think?
Top side is really good. Bottom side is a little less good. Do I want to redo this? Yeah, that's like perfect. Okay, I think I know what the problem is. The outside is getting oxidized. I was putting the torch on this side and it was getting a little bit oxidized. But this side was sitting in the forge and getting all of those like flames against it. So this side is like perfect. But this, what do I want to do? Yeah, this side is so perfect. It's just that the other side is not perfect. Do I have any other methods of heating this? I could tilt the forge sideways. So the first quench didn't necessarily turn out the best, but I did learn how to theoretically get a perfect patina. I mentioned that the side of the guard facing the outside was getting oxidized, so in hopes of keeping everything in a reducing atmosphere before the quench, I turned this cheap propane forge onto its side so I could lower the entire piece into the forge. It's a little difficult to see temp. Hopefully I eyeball it correctly. 3, 2, 1, fingers crossed. Ooh, I see a good red in there. Ooh! Oh my god! Woo! Okay, I'm really happy I redid that. Holy shit. That is like perfect. It looks good right now, but the thing with this finish is that it can fade, but you can seal it in. And what I'm gonna do to seal it in is, I'll show you in a minute. That's so good, that's so good. The second time being the charm has been a fairly recurring theme in this video, and it definitely was true for this patina process as well. I'm really happy that I decided to redo it, because that red looks so freaking good. But if you remember, Rengoku's guard is not red throughout, only the inner channel is red. So what I did is I took it over to my granite slab and sanded it to turn the outer edges orange again. Now, the only reason that this works is because of the Japanese engraving that I did earlier. I brought the depth of the channel low enough to where the sandpaper can't hit it. Look at that. This is going to be the orange. It's going to be the red right here. And with the brass in the center, you have that perfect yellow, red, orange. It looks so good. Once I was happy with the sanding on the flats, there was one last area that I had to sand on the guard, and that was the outside edges. For the most part, this was pretty easy. I just needed to move up the grits and keep all my sanding lines straight. But in order to get into the small radiuses in the flame tendrils, I had to bust out the old drill and brass rod trick. Back in the day, I used this trick to speed up my hand sanding on my kitchen knife choils, and it definitely came in super handy here. With the guard done, it was now time to turn my attention back to the saya. Rengoku's katana saya looks pretty simple in design, but if you really think about how you'd get this design onto the saya without the use of something like a printer, it gets much more complicated. My plan to get this design onto the saya was with spray paint and masking tape. And because the line work is very obviously black in the anime, the first coat that I put onto the wood was with black spray paint. I made sure to get the highest quality spray paint I could find and to also get the coat as even as possible. Later, I was going to be doing a poly coat on top of this finalized design just as an extra layer of protection for the piece. Alright, so unfortunately, the pattern on the sheath of like his katana is one of the most confusing things that I've ever seen. Like, it's also different in a lot of the frames. Why is this part not gray? And then you come over here and it is gray. So is it gray, white, or is it like this? I'm so confused. Okay, what I'm gonna do is sort of go by this reference right here. I'm not actually sure if this is official artwork, but it's the cleanest thing that I can reference. And what I'm gonna do now is just take some really thin masking tape that I found and just mark out all of these lines. Okay, I've decided that I need to space these exactly 3 inches apart. Yeah, what I'm gonna do is first lay out these like lines on this side and the other side just so I have a nice framework. And then I'll go in later and do like the smaller lines. I think that framework is mostly there. All right, I'm gonna go on to the next step and I need to actually figure out what that is first. Yeah, this is the next line that I wanna do. I'm gonna do the one that goes from here to here. And I'm just marking the center point to make sure that I start from the same place. I've been here for half an hour already, by the way. This is not moving fast at all. That already kind of looks pretty cool. It's fairly even. It's not perfect, but once I spray paint it, it'll look pretty cool. All right, so the line that I'm doing right now is this line right here. And I realized that it's actually very easy to perfectly trim the lines with a knife later. So I'm like overhanging it and I'll cut off this section right here later. All right, it's come to my attention that it's supposed to be like this and not like this. And that makes sense. Boom. That is pretty good. I'm actually amazed I managed to figure this out. When I first looked at it, I had absolutely no idea where any of the lines went. Just need to do it on the other side, and then we'll be ready to paint. All right, so the way that I could do this is these are supposed to be white and these are supposed to be gray. I could mask off one of the parts and paint the other part, but then that means later I have to mask off this part, because that would require 2 maskings. But if I don't mask it right now, and I paint everything, say, white, and then I mask off this and paint this gray, I only need to mask 1 time. All right. Laying all of the masking tape onto the saya was definitely the hard part of this entire thing, and now that that was finished, I was feeling pretty good. What I did after that was I simply did a coat with gray spray paint, and then I let it dry, and then I masked off all the areas that were meant to be gray in preparation for the white spray paint. In theory, once I peeled off all of the masking tape after that white paint dried, I would be left with the Rengoku saya design. The unfortunate thing about this process though was that I couldn't ever check my work, and that meant all of this was just conjecture. So I guess we'll have to wait and see if my strategy was the right one.
We're gonna call that good.
All right, what I want to do, I'm not actually gonna wrap it right now. I just wanna see where I need to drill the hole for the pin. I made the mistake in the past where I wrap it and then I drill the hole and accidentally fray some of the wrap. Ooh, that's gonna look sick.
I think I want to have the hole around here. Okay, we'll preemptively mark this as the spot we're gonna put it in the center.
One of the things about a katana that's different from most modern blades is that they're held together with just one pin, the Mekugi pin. I already mimed the wrapping process, so I knew exactly where my hole needed to be drilled. Now, the important thing that I learned is that this hole has to be drilled on a diagonal. If you think about it, the wrapping alternates on both sides of the Tsuka, so if there's space for a hole on one side, the opposing side won't. One of the other things about this Mekugi pin slot is that the pin is supposed to taper, and to accomplish this, I drilled the hole on the first side with a pretty big drill bit, and then I changed the bit to a smaller one for the hole on the other side. Once I had both of these holes drilled in the Tsuka, I marked where the hole should be in the tang, and then I drilled that hole with a drill bit that was the average size of the two bits that I used on the Tsuka. That probably sounded more complicated than it had to be, but just know that without this tapering slot, there would be no tightening effect from inserting the pin. That is pretty perfect. It's offset this way very, very slightly on both sides, which means that once I drive that tapered peg in, it's going to lock everything together. The traditional material used to make the Mekugi pin itself is a special kind of bamboo known as susudake. I once tried making this pin in the past with a pair of chopsticks, but I quickly learned that chopsticks are made from a softer kind of bamboo, so since then I've been using micarta as my Mekugi pin material. Now, if I had a lathe, I would probably use that to shape the taper on my pin, but I don't have a lathe, so I decided to use my trusty hand drill and my grinder to create that taper. I kept going back and forth between grinding and test fitting, and once I was happy with the overall fit up, I cut off the excess and the Mekugi pin was done. One of the things that I was testing for this build here was a new product called gator skin. Most of my fittings were made from either copper or brass, and both of these tend to tarnish over time, and the hope was that this new gator skin would help prevent that and keep the piece looking new forever. I do have to say though that this didn't work perfectly, and that within 2 weeks all of the pieces tarnished a tiny bit. I ended up going with a more trusty Renaissance wax finish, and that's held up pretty well so far. Now, on a completely different note, the spray paint on the sheath has finished drying, so let's see how the final design turned out. Alright. This sheath has so many hours of work just into the taping alone. We finally get to see if it actually looks good. The gray was sealed off really well from the white, which is a very, very good sign. Now let's see if the really thin tape sealed off the black. Okay, it's not bad. Okay, it looks really clean, look at that. I think this might be the greatest thing I've ever done. And look at this. I have a piece of tape over the place where I have the Kurigata, or whatever you call it. Oh, it's clean wood. I think that's it. That looks pretty freaking good. The design on the sheath looked so much better than I could have ever hoped for, but before I could call it done, I needed to give it a polyurethane coat. I did this coating on the Saya for Shusui, and I really liked how it offered a bunch more protection, but also cured extremely clear and didn't muddy the design at all. Because of that, I figured putting it on this sheath was a no-brainer. I ended up doing 2 coats of this polyurethane on the sheath, and once the second coat had been drying for a couple days, the last thing I needed to do on the sheath was to glue the Kurigata into the slot. Luckily, this process wasn't too complicated, and all I had to do was polish it, mix some epoxy, and then clamp the two together for about a day. Up next on the hit list is the Ito wrap on the handle. I would say that this wrap is probably the most iconic thing about a katana, and you can argue that the curve in the blade is slightly more well known, but regardless, they're in the same ballpark. Now, the traditional material that people use for this wrap is silk, but I personally think that even the highest quality silk looks inferior to a leather wrap, so that's the material that I'm using here. I do have to give a quick shout out though, because I couldn't find a good source for high quality leather wrap, and I sent Valley at Sortus a message, and within a couple weeks I had a package with the highest quality leather wrap that I've ever seen. This is so stressful, I feel like I'm doing terribly even though it looks good. This wrap is literally going right over the hole. What do I do about this? I'm gonna undo the last couple wraps and redo them a little bit tighter so that the wrap is closer to not being over the hole. We've made it back to the hole. That looks a lot better. Look at that. I haven't even glued it and that's not over the hole yet. With that first section finalized and not interfering with the hole at all that was left to do was slowly make my way down the handle. I had to make sure to alternate which cord was going on top, and I also always checked to see if the diamonds were even.
What do you do? Ow.
One of the things that you might notice if you know a lot about katanas is that I didn't make any Menuki. Traditionally, Menuki were 2 ornaments that people put under the Ito wrap, and these were meant to signify something deeply personal to the user. Rengoku is the flame Hashira, and I was considering making 2 flame ornaments to act as my Menuki, but seeing as I already changed the design of the handle from the original, I didn't want to create 2 ornaments completely out of thin air for this piece.
Okay, this needs to go under there. Hey. At this point, this should be on, which is easy enough, you know. And now I gotta deal with this one right here. It's supposed to go through here. This stuff is really grippy. Yes. Let's go. All right, that's literally done, so. Please don't rip, please don't rip. Nice. Tiny ball of paper.
How does this look with the Kashira?
That's a good handle. I'm happy with that.
With the Ito wrap on the handle finished, the last thing I want to do before I etch my maker's mark and reveal the Hamon on the blade is to tie the Sageo wrap on the saya. The Sageo wrap is what traditionally helps secure the sword to the wearer's waist, and to be completely honest, it's one of the parts of the katana that I know the least about. If you take a look at how swords are carried in most anime, characters like Zoro usually have them tucked into a sash of some kind, and Rengoku isn't much different with his white belt. Literally everybody ignores the existence of this knot, but once again, in the hopes of making this piece as realistic as possible, I wanted to put it on this piece.
That's one of them, and I need to do the other. Okay, that one's tightened.
With the Sageo wrap done, it was time to etch my maker's mark. I was definitely playing around with the idea of engraving my Chinese name into the tang, but I haven't practiced calligraphy or Chinese writing in general in over a decade, so I decided to play it safe and go with my regular maker's mark. One of the interesting things about a katana is that the maker's mark is always put onto the tang of the piece. This is different from modern Western blades because they usually have the mark on the blade itself. I think that the reason for this difference stems from the fact that katana usually have a takedown design, but it might also have something to do with being humble. I don't really know.
Let's see how that looks. That does in fact look pretty good. Very nice. All right, now we darken.
With my maker's mark done and looking pretty good in my opinion, it was time to sand the blade to 1000 grit and then etch my Hamon. This is a higher grit than I usually go to for Hamons, but the hope was that the final product would have a bit more of a shiny finish rather than a matte one. Now, this process ended up taking more hours than I would like to admit, but this is what it looked like halfway through, and this is what it looked like when I was happy with the overall finish. Big difference, right?
This thing has such a nice 1000 grit finish on it, and there's a non-zero chance that I completely mess it up during this etch. That looks pretty clean. Alright, fingers crossed. Okay, first etch. A little shorter than 3 minutes, but let's see what we got. Oh, that looks like... What? That side looks so good. pretty good. I think for the etches after this, I'm going to cap out at 2 minutes. And I'm going to do just more etches.
Oh yeah, there we go. Oh yeah. That looks pretty good, but I think I can get more contrast. I'm gonna do at least 2 more etches. Alright, and we go for round 2. Minute 30. Alright. I ended up doing 3 total etching cycles to fully bring out the Hamon, but after polishing away all these oxides, the blade was finished, and this build is finally coming to an end. It's honestly hard to believe how many new things I learned while making this sword. I learned how to do more intricate work with a jeweler's saw, how to create a red copper patina, and I even took my first steps into Japanese engraving. In a lot of ways, this feels like a homecoming build. Over the past 3 years of making Japanese blades, each and every project has taught me something different, and this blade gave me the opportunity to bring all of these lessons together into a single piece. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me create Rengoku's sword from start to finish. It's been a wild ride, and after 4 months of work, I'm happy to finally present you the finished piece.
Don't you know that I got you? Quit it out with this nonsense, they don't know about a thing. 잠깐 쉬어가 도 돼. 내게 빌려줄게, 네 속도에 맞출게. Baby, let's go for a ride. 쓸데없는 생각 뒤로 한 채. Boy, don't you know it's true? We're gonna go with you all night. Baby, 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 생각하지 말고 그냥 느껴봐. Just groove it to your body. Baby, 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 너와 함께라면 다 할 수 있어. Baby, don't worry, baby, think. Don't you baby, I got you. Locked in, lock it in. You know you want my loving. 이래도 저래도 네 편이 돼줄게. 난 너만.
It's a tangent curve. That was really easy.